We are lucky to have with us today Larry Coben. Larry is the director of the Sustainable Preservation Initiative, which he'll be talking about today. He is also a member of a famous cohort that entered the University of Pennsylvania in 1998 that's full of illustrious stars. Larry, he's also a Harvard alum. Although he was Yale undergrad, he graduated from Harvard Law in sometime in the distant past, 1981. Something. Yeah. And got his PhD from the University of Pennsylvania in anthropology in 2012. Larry's primary research focuses on Inca sites, Inca colonial sites. Can we say that? Inca colonialism.
Yeah, you can say that.
Right. And Larry is among many other things, Larry is the co-editor of a volume with Takeshi Yamada called Archaeology of Performance that many of you know, I'm sure. So today, Larry's going to talk about his work with the Sustainable Preservation Initiative. So join me in welcoming Larry Coben.
Thanks, Matt. It's a pleasure to be here. I got to walk past my old dorm, which looks like the one building on campus that has not been renovated again. I was asked to point out that there is a discount currently available on Gary Urton's new book. So there's a big pre-publication discount. I think it's 30%, Gary, 35%.
Yeah. Whatever you say.
As we're done here, please rush to the web and make your purchases. So I've been thinking an awful lot about public archaeology and what archaeologists can be doing in the real world. And it's been brought together for me in two ways. One is the work that we're doing that I'm going to describe in some detail, but just to give you an idea, with investments from $10,000 to $50,000, we have now created in SPI 5 economically sustainable projects which have created enormous number of jobs for people who didn't have them before, for people who were living at or around the poverty line. And at the same time, those people have become an army of local community members who have protected their sites, and looting and encroachment has essentially stopped on the sites that we've been working. And that's been all over in Peru and in Guatemala, and it's a paradigm that I want to start with that because we have enormous potential as archaeologists and anthropologists, not just to do our research, but to actually help the communities around us, which is certainly an expressed goal by many, though not always practiced as well by members of our profession. And the other thing that brought it really home for me was I was a discussant when the SAA was in San Francisco, I think it was 2015, in a public archaeology session. And I listened to 15 people who had spent a lot of time with a lot of optimism doing public archaeology. And all of their presentations, nobody told me what their objectives were, what their budgets were, and what their results were. And this is an incredible and common theme in public archaeology, is we think it's good, and we don't step back and go, why are we doing it? What are we trying to accomplish? And who is benefiting from it? And as a discussant, one of the things I suggested was maybe we should take all this money, hire Angelina Jolie and Harrison Ford, and have them do an ad campaign that says, in our movies we destroy objects, but we never would do that in real life, neither should you. Would that have a greater impact than all these public archaeology programs? And it was obviously apocryphal and designed to stimulate discussion, but I think the time has come for all of us to be somewhat more reflective about what we are doing in terms of public archaeology in order to decide what its point and purpose is. Archaeology is at this incredible crossroads where, on the one hand, new technologies are opening up incredible new research questions for us. And on the other hand, and I suspect if you talk to any of the graduate students here doing their dissertation research, you would know this already, it's getting a lot harder to work in the field. The communities are wondering, what's in archaeology for us? If archaeology isn't bringing us any economic benefits, why should we care about it? Why should we allow it to be practiced? Why shouldn't we use our sites for something else? And this is not just an economic question, of course. I think it's a moral question. How do you ask people to stop looting or otherwise exploiting their site when that's what they need to do to survive, unless you're prepared to offer them an economic alternative. And one of the things I'm here to say is there is a way, I believe, to do both. I think we're doing it, but we need to think about what that means for anthropology and archaeology as a profession and an academic discipline if this is going to be important enough for us to do. So, you all know that heritage is being destroyed at an incredibly accelerating rate. This is the monumental site of Chotuna in Peru. Here is Petra. It doesn't matter where you go. And all the publicity is about ISIS blowing up things in Palmyra. And that's terrible, and that's awful. And I have no idea what to do about stopping ISIS. But what I do know is that the heritage being destroyed by ISIS is a tiny, tiny, tiny percentage of the heritage that we're losing every day. And everybody who actually studies this, and there aren't many, finds out that the biggest threat to heritage is economic development. It's energy, it's agriculture, it's commercial and residential development, and it's looting. And looting is every bit as much an economic activity as anything else, and we need to recognize it as such. And so, one of the things I think about is, well, if all of the problem is economically based, doesn't the solution have to be? And it seems to me that it does. And I first came to this realization because I know anthropologists love origin myths, but this is actually an origin reality, but we never talk about those, I don't think. I was doing my dissertation research at this incredible monumental site in Bolivia called Inca Yacta. It's really an amazing, amazing, amazing place, as you can see. And when I got there, the community was a lovely group of people, but incredibly poor. Bolivia is still the poorest country in South America. At the time I was working there, people in these communities were subsisting on an average of $1 a day. We're talking abject poverty. And so they were growing crops on this site. There were cattle grazing all over it. And in this incredible building, which is the largest single-room roof structure in the Inca Empire, it's 80 meters by 25 meters, they would play soccer in here. Why? Because at 10,000 feet of altitude, the ball wouldn't roll away. Those of you who've worked at high altitude know very, very well the last thing you want to do when the ball goes out of bounds is you have to go chase it. Here you had walls. So it was kind of like indoor soccer field where the ball never got away. And none of those activities were particularly helpful for the site. They were all being quite destructive. And so I did what archaeologists and anthropologists traditionally do, is I said, let me tell you how important this site is and teach you about your own history. Yes, guys from New York doing that have great success in Bolivia when they use that particular methodology. They would all go, that's very interesting, and the next morning the soccer game would be going on. And so we had a lot of community meetings as I was working here for a while. Now, there was only one road to this site. It was over 100 miles from the nearest community. We get a few tourists every week. So I said, let's put a gate across the one road. We'll put it a few miles away so people can't hike or drive around it. Bolivians can pass for free, and foreigners will charge them $10 because they've already got the guide, they've already got the car, they'll have to come out here. And they looked at me like, what kind of idiot would go look at these stones and pay 2 weeks' salary to do that? And so I am the last of the big time spenders, as we've already established. I said, I will pay for the gate, and I'll pay for a few weeks of guard wages. This investment was a whopping $50 on my part. So we put the gate up. First week, 4 tourists came, $40. The next week, 3 more, 70. That's 70 total. I said, wow, I should be doing venture capital again because that's a heck of a return, $70 in 2 weeks on 50. But what really happened, what was more important, was it changed the attitude of the community. This site no longer was some remote, intangible thing of somebody's, maybe their past, maybe not. Some people thought of themselves as descendants from the Inca. Some people didn't care. But what it did was it turned this into a potentially sustainable economic asset that could feed their families today and in the future. And all the preaching in the world about the site didn't have the same impact that that particular action and realization had. And it was extraordinary. Interestingly, then, of course, they wanted to learn more about the site as much as they could because there was a relationship between knowledge and their current existence. And that time, making archaeology relevant to the community today was really the big difference maker. So I came out, gung-ho, armed with this realization, figuring other people must have had this realization and be doing this in archaeology, and that wasn't the case, nor was there another foundation that was doing it. And the reason I founded the Sustainable Preservation Initiative was I felt that this was such an important aspect of community relationships, plus the fact we could actually, as archaeologists, help alleviate poverty. I mean, that's an extraordinary accomplishment in and of itself. And if we could do that and at the same time stop looting and stop economic activity, a big win. You know what the community did with the dollars first? They bought out the grazers, they bought out the people growing the crops, and they built a soccer field across the river. So, and in looking back, somebody, as Matt mentioned, I had a business career before, and as someone who had done several years of energy entrepreneurship, this probably should have been masterfully obvious to me, but clearly it wasn't, and so I wanted to go out and spread the word as to what this would mean. And so we've now kind of come back in order to take this on as types of projects where we're going to do. So what are we doing and how have we done it? We started 5 years ago, and I'll tell you, we learned a heck of a lot. So I want to try to share some of those lessons with you, because sadly, this isn't taught in any department. The practical economic development, it's not surprising. Most people don't go and get a PhD in anthropology or archaeology because they want to be a small-scale social entrepreneur. I was fortunate to have the background, but I think it's, as we reflect on the way departments work, how do we incorporate some of the lessons I'm about to talk about, other than coming by for one talk? How do we incorporate that into curriculum, and how do we reward people for doing it? Because you all know better than me, you don't get tenure or promotion or salary bumps in general for doing social entrepreneurship and economic development programs. So we learned a few lessons. The first thing is, it's not enough to teach people to make pretty things or products. You have to teach them to run businesses. And we've spent the last 5 years developing what I would call a mini business school. Now, you all know that you go to every site and they all these programs teaching people to make things, but if you don't know how to do customer service, if you don't know how to do inventory management, if you don't know how to procure materials, if you don't actually spend time calculating the number of hours that it takes you to make a product so you know if you're actually making a living wage, you can't run a successful, sustainable business. Point 2 was, these things had to be sustainable. A project that lasts only as long as you are working at your site, I would suggest, is about you and not about your community. So the key is these businesses had to be able to run on their own, so that when we went away, and our goal is to be out of these communities in 3 years, if we're not out in 3 years and they're able to self-sustain, that doesn't mean you can't call for advice or help or whatever, but no more funding. If you're not self-sustainable in 3 years, that's a failure because you're creating a dependency. And that's the greatest failure of many development and aid projects that we see is keep funding, keep funding. Well, I know you're going to pay me every year regardless of what I do. That's like being a tenured faculty member. No, just kidding. Just kidding. Could resist. But there's not a powerful incentive for you to create and grow a business if you know that the money is going to keep coming every year. There's no incentive to improve your product. There's no incentive to do a whole slew of things. So sustainability would be the second thing. The third thing was scale. Because the sad postscript to the Inca Yacta story is 5 years later, the Inter-American Development Bank decided they were going to build a $250,000 visitor center here, tore down the gate, and of course this visitor center sits empty because they had no budget for maintenance, they had no budget for curation. That was just supposed to kind of happen on its own. And I don't care where you work, I bet if you walked around, you could probably do a tour of empty or half-empty visitor centers, site museums. And the reason is I actually delved into this, talked to USAID in Jordan. I said, how are you all evaluated as program officers? And the answer was, we're evaluated in two ways. One is how much money we spend. Wow. And two, how many jobs we create. And I said, well, what's the definition of a job? A sustainable job is considered a job that lasts for 30 days. Well, you don't have to be a genius to know if you want to spend a lot of money and create a lot of short-term jobs, build a big building. And by the way, you don't even have to have any knowledge of your community and what they need to do that. You know, you go, you hire some people, you throw it up, there it is, here's your beautiful visitor center, you have a nice ceremony, and you go back 5 years later, and you find that nothing has stuck. So for me, it starts small. That's why I began by saying all the projects we've done have been 10 to 50,000, and quite frankly, the number has been going down every year as we get better at our process. And when we build a building, we build one room. And when that room is full and fully utilized, we will build another. Now, I think I am now the godfather of 4 one-room buildings in Peru, and I don't want to be a godfather of anything bigger than that. Because people, if your maintenance budget is bigger than the GDP of your surrounding community, you're going to get a big F. The other thing that does, of course, is it distorts the kinds of projects you see. When we began looking in Jordan, every proposal we got was for $300,000 project. And I was like, well, why? And delving in, I found out USAID and the Ambassadors Fund favorite amount to fund in the country, $300,000. So someone proposed to me at a site a $300,000 community center, having just finished a $300,000 site museum that was empty. And so I was like, well, why don't we just spend $3,000 and take these 2 rooms in your empty site museum and turn them into, you know, a business center, a community center, whatever you want to call it. And that was as if I was speaking a foreign language. And I had the same issue when we tried to work in Haiti. There were so many NGOs running around, like putting people on consulting retainers for $5,000 and $6,000 a month, that they would look at me and say, well, you want to do a $15,000 project, how am I going to get my $5,000 or $6,000 retainer? You're distorting the marketplace for these kinds of projects. So another important element as we do this is scale. The fourth thing is, and this we all ought to be good at, is understand your social structure and take it as it is. You can't run classes in macho countries for women from 9 to 5 a day. You've got to figure out when in their calendars, if you're going to work with women, they can get who will you get, when can they come? Is it a place where cooperatives work better than individual entrepreneurs? What's your local economic structure? Who are the people you don't want to know with? You have to know that and understand it. That has to be self-tailored. There are certain aspects that can be modules. Business, accounting, inventory management, legal, but not things of that nature. So the fourth is to take your communities as you have them, but with one exception, and that is you have to reach the women. You have to involve them in your project, and you have to be exceptionally clever at figuring out how to do that. Because it's not easy, and those of you who work in male-dominated countries, which I guess might be all of them, but at least macho, not male-dominated, would probably be a better way to put that. But the point being, you have to do, and the reason is a simple one. Every single person who studies it, women entrepreneurs, do better in these projects and are more responsible with the profits, and their communities thrive better when you support them. That's number one. Number two is, for many of them, it is the only economic opportunity they will ever receive. And when people get one economic opportunity, they grab it, run with it, and hold on to it for dear life. And that's a big bit of what entrepreneurship is about. And I want to just give you a couple examples, of the kinds of social change that can bring about. And then I want to go into some case studies of some of the results that we have had, so that I'm not just blowing smoke, there's real data behind this. Okay, this woman on the right is a 77-year-old grandmother. This is her daughter-in-law, and they're both members of a 23-person cooperative that we formed at the site of Pachacamac in Peru in conjunction with the site director there, Denise Posi-Escott. And they've gone through a 2-year capacity building program with all the things I did. And that program includes things like, you have to be part of the legal economy. Why? Because you can't get big bulk orders even if somebody wants to help you, and people can't pay with credit cards unless you're in the formal economy. And most of the people haven't done that. You have to be a legally formed corporation. You need to understand basic accounting. You need to understand procurement. You need to understand inventory management and seasonality in tourism. Because there's 6 months a year where this site is packed and there's 6 months it's not. You need to understand how to manage your business accordingly. So when we have women working, we frequently interview them when we start what their goals are. We talk to what they like and what we don't like. They have roundtables. And I asked her, I said, you're 77 years old. You know, why are you here heading up the embroidery group? She's there every day doing incredible embroidery on bags. And she looked at me with this look and said, no one ever gave me a chance to work before. I was like, and in fact, the answer we hear most frequently for why people are here is no one's given them a chance before. And what do they do with the money? Now they all feel like they don't worry their electricity is going to be turned off, or their water, or their school fees. Basic things that we take for granted. And so what we're trying to provide here, and that's an extraordinary change. Now this is her daughter-in-law. She's been so successful. She actually won a scholarship to a local university to go study business, and she'll bring that knowledge back to this cooperative. So these folks in their first year in business, 24 of them, sold $10,000 worth of product. And this year, they're going to sell $16,000 worth of product. Now that's growth that anybody could pay for, but that's extraordinary. But what it talks about is you have all of this incredible potential, and what's missing? 2 things: resources and knowledge. And our goal at SPI is to provide those 2 things, resources and knowledge. We all know the story about give a person a fish they can eat for a day, teach a person to fish they can eat for a lifetime. Not true if they can't afford a rod and a reel. And that's why I say knowledge and resources, the 2 together. In many respects, we function like a micro venture capital firm. We don't take any money back, but we analyze businesses and try to invest in people and managements and cooperatives on that kind of a basis. There's a good segment. And these people become role models in their villages. When I first went to Pachacamac, I think you were there, these folks kind of would barely talk to me. They would kind of stare down at their laps and mumble and, si senor, si senor. Now, you can see they kind of like the camera. They jokingly shove each other out of the way to be in videos and in pictures. They've got their own Facebook page. I encourage you to look at it, Sisan, S-I-S-A-N. And it's extraordinary. So, and they're now back in their communities serving as role models for others. And the biggest issue they now have is they need to add more people. And the big thing is, how do we do that? How do we compensate people who haven't been here from the beginning? Of course, that's made me realize that we need to change the curriculum that we're teaching in our mini business school to include, okay, when you're having these types, because we taught a lot about what to do when you're in trouble for things to do. When you're having success, how do you manage success? It's a much more fun thing to be able to manage, by the way. So the second story I want to share with you before going into the data is we have these roundtables, and this woman brought her husband sitting over there, which nobody usually does, and I was like, okay. And at the end, he said, would you mind if I spoke? Everyone was like, okay, sure, not really knowing. He said, when my wife started to work, I told her I was opposed to the idea, and if my meals were not on time, if the kids were not in school, if the house wasn't clean, etc., 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 she would have to stop working. And he said, after watching her work for a year, and seeing not just the benefits of the income to my family, but to her self-esteem and in her mothering and all his things, this is his quote, he said, mi muro de Berlin se cayó. My Berlin Wall fell. I wish I'd had a camera with me or a video person at the time, he is now the biggest proponent in his community for women working. And that's extraordinary change in these kinds of communities. I mean, he's a fireman going around in these communities saying that women need to be working more. So I give you these qualitative examples for two. One is we can actually make not just economic change, but social change. Now, I think those are the same thing. I think there's nothing more social than economics, but not everyone in anthropology agrees with me. But we can make changes, and I am reporting about impact that's not quantitative. Because people always go, oh, all you do is report numbers and quantitative. No, these are real ethnographic stories that we have collected to show that the paradigm is working. And we have a lot more. But we also have incredible amounts of economic success. I told you about folks in Pachacamac, and what are they making? The first thing they did was they designed, as part of our program, we teach about the site so people can do designs and incorporate into their projects iconography and stories of the site. Now the first thing they did very cleverly was, some people have great artisan skills, and here there were less. Pachacamac is in the desert, and you would not believe how, even during sunny season, how many people show up without a sun hat. They made sun hats with logos that they designed on them with the name CSUN, bought them for $4, add $1 to add the logo, stole them for $10 a tourist, still the bestseller that they have. Now they're also doing embroidered bags, postcards, and they try a product. If it doesn't sell, they know on their own now, stop making it, going to the next one. What role do we still have? We still advise them. They ask us questions. The other thing that we try to do is, the one thing the communities still can't do, and we're still working to solve that problem, how do you open new markets for them off the site? Now this site Pachacamac gets 130,000 visitors, so less of a problem, but sites that get 3,000 or 4,000, where else can we sell? Now Pachacamac has a new site museum, and we're now selling products from all the Peruvian SPI projects in there. And as a result, these ladies from Chotuna, let's be the other way, sorry. My advisor would be very upset that I don't know the order of my slides. These women are making incredible, incredible textiles, which they always had. And they're now, 33% of their sales are now in the site museum in Pachacamac, which is great because one of the reasons we did this project is a new road was supposed to be built to this incredible monumental site. That was 4 years ago, and there's still no road. So we worked with these folks. They were already terrific weavers. The issue is, how do you make products that people want to sell? What kind of design? So you can see this matches the iconography of the site. The other thing is, on these backstrap looms, the easiest thing to make is table runners, or mantle covers, whatever you want. And people just made nothing but, well, a lot of people don't use those anymore. So now, of course, we're slicing these, having them slice these up, and we're selling placemats, and we're selling napkins, and they're selling incredibly well. The products are, as you can see, spectacularly beautiful. And these women are now making a living and beginning to think about, as their markets expand, what they're going to do. Now, this project grew much more slowly because that road didn't go in. It made us kind of focus more on where else can we market this, because they would sell at the site, they would sell at a local museum, but one that didn't have a ton of traffic. And as one of our early projects, we probably spent too much time on how to weave and not as much time on how to run a business. And so we started with 13 women, we went down to 7, and now it's going back up. And that's actually fairly normal numbers, because one of the things we have learned is whatever number of people show up, particularly if it's women the first day, it's going to be cut by 50% because of all the macho things I've already discussed. So the 24 at Pachacamac, week 1 were 50, they were 15, now they're 8. But again, they're making a real living doing their weaving. They do much of it at home, and then they come out to the site to sell, so it's not forcing them out of their social structure. Now, when you create these kinds of jobs and opportunities, social change occurs, but they're driving their own social change. It's not somebody from outside saying you need to be doing X. They are driving their own sorts of social change. We do occasionally work with male cooperatives as well. The gentleman here on the left is Julio Ibarola, who's an extraordinarily master ceramicist. You can see here he's making a 4x replica of a spouted jar that came out of the excavations of Luis Jaime Castillo at San Jose de Moro. Julio was originally on the digging crew. Julio got interested in how moche ceramics were made and painted, built his own kiln, and started firing them and painting them. And you can see what an extraordinary, extraordinary artist he is. And Julio has now created a studio of people at this site making these kinds of products. Julio being, our first person, he got no business training. We went 2 years later and had to go back and give some business. The first year or two, a bunch of tour buses stopped by. They went to visit Luis Jaime's field school. Everybody got off the bus and bought a replica. Julio ran out of inventory. That's when we added inventory to our business school teaching class, inventory management. But the year that there wasn't a big field school there, his sales declined, but Julio's now selling in that patch of comic museum. We've also changed some of the products. These things are wonderful, but even at regulation, they break. So Julio is now making more plates and cups. For those of you who've been to my house, I have a set of 12 moche plates and cups that I set my table with. We don't eat off them because they're not designed for that, but that's the decorative. So the point being, this kind of program that we're doing, Julio's been in business for 5 years, self-sustained. We haven't given him any money since 2012, maybe 2013, and his business is running. And this was a site where looting and encroachment occurred all the time. It's essentially stopped, at least within the boundaries of the site, because this group of people is making sure that that doesn't do it. So I could go on and give you these kinds of examples, but we have the potential to do this. But to do it, we need to change the way we practice archaeology and anthropology and put things like this into the forefront of our curriculum. Otherwise, we're sending people out there who simply aren't trained to do it and destined to fail. Now, if you don't want to do it yourself, a place like Harvard, you've got development economists, you've got people in the Kennedy School, you've got people in the business school, and let me tell you, for a free trip to Peru, or a free trip to Guatemala, or a free trip to wherever you're working and a chance to work on a dig, because people think it's glamorous and we won't tell them that it's not till they get there. People will help you, and they want to help you. So it's incumbent on you at least to know the fundamental questions so you can bring the right people. And in the future, I know this is a long-term, this needs to be every bit as important, in my opinion, as publishing and research for tenure. Because this, for me, is the future of archaeology. We have the incredible and extraordinary luck and potential to be able to build futures and save paths while we're doing our work. Thank you.
Questions for Larry? Why don't you just call from
In the back.
What suggestions do you have for people working in areas that don't have a lot of tourists or foreign tourists coming in?
Yeah, I mean, it's extremely it's more difficult, but I think that's why, and I'll have more suggestions here, that's why we've started to look at other markets, both international and domestic, where people are looking for handicraft markets or things. It's much, much tougher because you need to set up all kinds of supply chains and supply lines. Like right now, for example, to get our projects to the Pachacamac Museum from our other projects, Julio Ibarola's brother basically takes his truck, drives from site 1 to site 2 to site 3 to Pachacamac, and rides a little bit of a circuit. So we're looking at how do you set up, what's the best way? So I don't have a great answer for you, but it has to be opening other markets. Because if you don't have anything sustainable, you don't have that kind of opportunity to create these kind of jobs. And I don't recommend that people start unless they do, because there's so many development projects where people are taught a skill, and then when the class is over, there's no use for that skill, and it only ticks people off that you spend 6 months at school and there's no job going forward for you, because most of these programs don't think about markets. My favorite is always in Cambodia. They love to train people to work on the stone temples. We train these people to be stone carvers. I said, well, that's great, but when your project's over, what are they going to do? Does anyone else buy stone carvings? Oh. well, maybe we need to keep our project going, and that's fine, but that's a dependency that you're creating forever. So if you're really in a remote spot, maybe I'll get invited back in a few years to talk about how successful we've been at opening markets. This is the #1 thing we're working on. And we're trying to decide, do we need actually to set up a either not-for-profit or for-profit marketing company that would ultimately be owned by people in the communities to handle distribution, packaging, and remarketing? So I'm not proposing that this is a universal solution that can work at every set. I don't believe that such a thing exists. But I do think it's an important aspect. I also think it enhances all the other things that we want to do, like impart knowledge. When we talk now about healthcare to people, we have this credibility from bringing money. So if we make healthcare suggestions, they're taken more seriously, or bring healthcare experts. But this, because of its sustainable nature, they know it's about them and not about me. And I think that's really important. Bill?
Oh, so fascinating, great stuff. We got to hear about some of the projects from Sol when she participated in a heritage seminar a couple of years back. It's really extraordinary work, and very pleased that you've been able to do all of these things. I am curious, as somebody who works in Mesoamerica, how different the context of your work in Caminal Huyu is, because it's in the middle of Guatemala City. I mean, it's a miracle there's any Caminal Huyu left. How do you get into that market when there's already so much going on in Quad City in terms of tourism and products and all that?
I mean, because of its urban nature and because of the things that you know better than I do, we actually have an alliance with a NGO there called Wakami. And Wakami makes jewelry and other products, and they already have an international distribution system. What was new for them, Wakami, is they had only worked before in rural areas. So there were two questions. One is, will this work in an urban area? Number two is, they generally design projects based on, women's culture. Can you design products that are related to the site that will create the kind of ties that we're trying to create? Because it's great to alleviate poverty, but we really also want to do is create stronger ties to heritage. So in fact, if you go on Target.com, you can buy the Rebirth Caminal Huyu line of jewelry right now. See? Holidays are coming up, people. So this is a good time to go and do that. So, and I would say, Bill, that it's done great for economic development. It's increased the relationship, but the relationship between the community and the site is still not as strengthened as the ones where they're working there. And that's another part of our learning process that we're going to have to iterate through. Part of the problem is the authorities are reluctant to let the women come there and make jewelry, and actually it's safer and they prefer to make it at home. They wouldn't let us set up a small little tiny shop there for jewelry. And so these are the kinds of things that would greatly enhance the site, and we're hopeful that the results that we're getting here, there, and around the world will actually encourage governments to adopt this paradigm. So in Peru, the Capacñan, which is the Inca Road Project World Heritage, we have a convenio with them to try to do this all through the Capacñan. Pachacamac is the first one. Of course, the government changed, their budget was cut, so we're kind of proceeding on our own, but we're very hopeful that that will come back. Because if the governments will try to drive this paradigm, that's one of the two ways to grow. The other, as I mentioned to you earlier, is we are now taking all of this and trying to put it into a manual or a methodology so that we can almost franchise this. Because it doesn't have to be an archaeologist who spreads this, and by the way, this works every bit as well at a natural site or an animal site or all kinds of sites. Let's get some social entrepreneurs to drive this, because quite frankly, they're more used to and they're better trained to do it than archaeologists are. And there's still an important role for the archaeologist there, but given the structure of the profession and the training, might be better to have somebody else leading the charge. Yes?
So to evangelize contemporary archaeologists with this notion that they should be involved in this, where do the native Peruvian archaeologists do they have any role in this? Do they see what can be done?
Sol, you want to stand up? I mean, Sol is a native Peruvian archaeologist. She was our director of Peru for 2 years. I'm the only gringo. Our entire team consists of Peruvian archaeologists and other Peruvians. The people with whom we're collaborating on site our site director is all Peruvian architects. This doesn't work, expats coming down for 1 month and trying to do it. So our model is decentralize and then decentralize some more and push everything down to as local a level as possible. What I mentioned about the marketing company is, yet it's hard for somebody in a small village in northern Peru to open a market up in a big store in Lima, much less internationally. So we're still serving in that, but even that is all Peruvians. I mean, I'm the only American on the SPI payroll, and I don't really get paid, so I guess we don't have any Americans on the SPI payroll. So this does not work if it's an expat-driven process.
So if I may follow up, so,
Sure.
but you're saying that this should be taught in American department. Is it taught in Peru?
No, and it needs to be taught there too. Fair point. It needs to be taught everywhere. Because the people in the communities, I mean, the anthropologists, the people in the communities, whether they're gringo, you know, if you're working for a long term in a community, you should have a pretty good sense of its social structure. Whoever knows that needs to be the one to ask enough questions and bring the right people to bear. And, you know, one of the things, you know, but for example, all our trainers of all those things, accounting, legal, marketing, they're all Peruvians. Jared?
Maybe you just answered my question, but I was interested in the training. So, I mean, in just educating people, and to what degree do you find that you have to educate people? I had a case. I was working in Bolivia one time near a development project for working with women weavers, and it struck me one day that the women, when they were paid for their weavings, they would always take their money to one woman who knew how to count. And they would make sure that she counted their profits to be certain that they were correct. And so when you talk about marketing and accounting, et cetera, I mean, those are very technical subjects, but presumably they can be taught in sort of non-technical ways.
And we are teaching them. I mean, there are, you know, and they kind of, every one of these companies kind of figures out its own leadership structure or organizational structure. I mean, I went to Pachacamac one time, shortly after we taught what an org chart was, and they had just done their own org chart. And the presentation they made to this foundation potential donor, each of them explained where they were on the org chart and what they did. I wanted to cry, but I was too busy translating, and I will say that was the biggest check we've ever gotten from a foundation. But, you know, the folks can get this. They just never had any exposure to it. And that's why the program isn't a 1 month program. Because some of these things you need to come back to and come back to again. And there will be some people who are better at different aspects of it. And what's been fascinating as we study these is to see, especially in the bigger ones like Pachacamac, they need to figure out how to divide the labor optimally. So there are some people who are, they all laugh, are terrible embroiderers, but they're great at quality control, or they're great at procurement, or they're great at sales. And these folks have all kind of figured this out with, you know, some guidance, but at the end of the day, they make the decisions, because when they first would have crises, they would say, well, we don't know how to divide the profits. And we then added a component about, here's several different ways that you can divide profits that have been done in other places. Now you all have to decide what's the best. They have to do their own dispute resolution.
Thanks, and I think it's wonderful what you've been doing with the women groups, like you said, and we've had a lot of success in our work with training and educating women in archaeology and conservation. And it seemed to us now at a site like where we work, which is large and tourism sort of takes care of itself, what we're interested in is really trying to sustain the people doing the archaeology locally and the conservation, and perhaps I don't know if you've worked on any CRM type of projects in foreign countries, and if that's something you advise on, or if you have any suggestions.
We haven't. You know better than me that it raises a tremendous set of issues, because there's no direct link between return and, I think when governments, the best hope you have is that governments realize, and they don't always, that this kind of thing has to be a sustainable asset. And there is a general trend towards sustainability. I mean, corporations are adopting it, several politicians, you know, it is that everybody is, even if they don't quite know what it means, they know that they want to be economically sustainable, environmentally sustainable. And I think, you know, we need the concept of heritage sustainability is probably something that we should be adapting. We all use it, but we don't really think of it in terms of expressing it in those in that kind of a language. But, you know, it's there's two things that are that's hard to resist. One is when, you know, other economic development, and the second is, of course, too much touristic development. Now, you know, thankfully there's a limited number of sites that are so touristically loved that they get overrun by tourists, and we've all probably visited them. But, you know, those are both you know, notions of sustainability really need to be incorporated into, you know, the way these things are thought about. I mean, that's why we put it in our name, is because of, you know, we recognized right off that that's where we were going, and well, we also figured that more people would take our phone calls if we had sustainable. Yeah.
Thank you so much for this thought-provoking presentation. I just have a question about the economic system, because you talked about this model is sort of run in a more like free market economy. But what do you foresee if this model is being applied in a more less free market economy, somewhere like China, for example?
I mean, there are parts of China, as you know better than I, that are probably more free market than anywhere in the US. I mean, if you have no ability to sell goods and services, this is not a model that will work. I mean, you don't need to be a free and open economy. We're not following all of the principles of entrepreneurship as you would in Silicon Valley. I mean, the notion of forming cooperatives, if you went to Silicon Valley and talked about cooperatives, they would laugh at you. They go, nothing can be done by committee, and that's true in some places, but not always, and the social structure is important. But however people generate their revenues and jobs, because even the most planned economies are rarely so planned as they're at the local level like this. Now, you often that means, how do you deal often with local leaders who are very powerful, who want to, in some way, as they used to say in The Godfather movie, wet their beak, you know, have a piece of the action. And one of the advantages of doing small-scale projects is there's not enough money to pay anybody else off. Somebody once asked me how I dealt with the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. I said, if you gave me 10 times as much money or 100 times as much money in a grant, I would be happy to deal with that, because I've dealt with it in my energy career several times. But for this amount of money, no one's going to even bother me to want to steal it. So by doing projects that generate 10,000, 20,000, you know, I always assume that there's a 10% leakage in everything we do, but that's a cost of doing business. So it's really when and when the business becomes powerful enough, they can push back on their own. Because I don't think we have any ability, you know, to deal with people in planned economies. And it may be that people don't want to start up in a planned economy, and you know, we don't do any projects if the community doesn't want us. And we've gone to communities and said, we think this would be interesting for you, and they go, we're not interested. And I go, okay, thank you very much. If you change your mind, you know where to find us.
Just a brief question. What about concepts of non-monumental places? Because you show, like, you know, sites, monumental sites, and
San Jose de Moro has no standing architecture. None. So it has very few visitors. It really only has, you know, archaeological cognoscenti, and most of the visitors come during the month or two that Luis Jaime Castillo and his team come. And there's not a single sign on the site. There's not a single explanation or anything. You know, I think that the sites that have less to see, probably that's why you go smaller scale, because they're not going to have the same number of visitors. But you know, but it really turns more on the community you're in. There are some communities where hiring 15 people, if it's a community of 100, that's enormous. You're employing 15% of the population. You know, in Coben, that's not going to do a whole lot. The scale needs to be bigger. I mean, it works on bigger scales, but you need to be able to have a bigger impact. But, I will also say that, those 25 women are from a pretty big community on the outskirts of Lima, and they're starting to have an impact socially. It's hard to measure, but, there's more general support when you go into the community. The director talks about there's more interest in their community programs, in their lecture series. Now, is that all because of our program? I don't think so. I have no way of knowing and don't have the resources to measure it, but I do think that that happens. But you do want to have at least some kind of touristic experience, but I find, even reconstructions and signage so that people can imagine what that mound looks like, some people will come. It may be very, very small. You may be surprised. Or the other thing that we try to do is put them on a circuit with others. So San Jose de Moro is near some monumental sites, so it's like, great, while you're driving from A to B, why don't you pull in here? I used to always show that we built a beautiful bathroom in San Jose de Moro. And we built it so buses would stop. You know what the biggest complaint we got in the guest book was? We didn't have enough bathrooms. And that's a great problem, as it means enough people are stopping there, and when they would stop, they would look at the products. So, bathroom building is very, 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 before we actually had economic results and we were starting out, that was about 3 minutes of my talk was bathroom building. And I still often include that. So, as I said, it's really studying the relationship between market, scale, and community to see whether there's anything there. And sometimes we come to a conclusion. We've looked at a lot of communities where we go, we can't figure out today how to make what we do here works. And it's heartbreaking because these folks are exceptionally poor. I mean, where I'm doing my field work right now in the Cañete, we hired 6 people to excavate. They said, would you mind coming over and talking to town about economic development? Because we've been talking, and they're talking, they don't have electricity, they don't have water, there's no real way to visit this site. And it's like, I'm sitting here racking my brains and, hoping maybe the Rotary clubs will do something. But what we do isn't gonna work for them. And I hate that, but I also have to recognize that that's the reality in which we're functioning, and I'm very conscious about us trying to do too much and getting away from what our core paradigm that we can implement successfully as an organization is. Because in foundations, mission creep is death. And there's a million examples out there. People get offered money to do things that they're not good at, and they waste the money and they destroy their culture at the same time.
Okay, thanks so much.
Thank you.